We're going to start with Bucha, and our first question is from Anny. Anny, I'm sending you love to Wales. Thank you for getting in touch. And you've got two questions, and we'll take on both of them. You're asking about the awful conduct of the Russian soldiers in Ukraine. Regarding the outrageous recent violence of the Russian soldiers in Ukraine, the mass rape, the ecstatic killings, do you think this represents that they're not controlled in a military hierarchy, like in Berlin in World War II? Or was this behavior intentionally allowed to let rip as a way to show Russia's and Putin's raw power, since the real power of the military ain't that impressive? Let me say something human first, and I'll say something about the Russian military. I tend to think that the most visceral human experiences that are universal, that's to say that I had in roughly the same way by people under different cultural circumstances, are death, war, childbirth, and serious illness. Now, we could start expanding that list, but I think the other additions will be more nuanced. We could talk about sex, of course. We could talk about the experience of great art. We could talk about the experience of food and the experience of wine. But I want to read you a couple of quotes. Both are about 20 years old. One's from a book called Humanity by a philosopher called Jonathan Glover, and he's quoting a Vietnam War vet who says that war is, for men, at some terrible level, the closest thing to what childbirth is for women. It's the initiation into the power of life and death. It's like lifting off a corner of the universe and looking at what's underneath. And we're going to keep talking through the construction noise. In England, there are thousands of buildings that have to be reclad following the Grenfell fire in London a couple of years back, and this building is one of those. Chris Hedges, the journalist, in a book called War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, I think it's a 20-year-old book, writes, "The godlike empowerment over other human lives and the drug of war combine, like the ecstasy of erotic love, to let our senses command our bodies. Killing unleashes within us dark undercurrents that see us desecrate and whip ourselves into greater urges of orgies of destruction. The dead, treated with respect in peacetime, are abused in wartime. They become pieces of performance art. Corpses were impaled in Bosnia on the side of barn doors, decapitated or draped like discarded clothing over fences." So that's the realm that we're in. But more concretely, what the fuck is going on there? So one thing that's really worth being aware of is that torture and ghastly practices that approximate to torture are not so much legal in Russia as normalized and institutionalized. So that's practiced by the National Guard, that's practiced by the police. You can be in a police interrogation room and have a broom put up your bottom. That happens, and there aren't consequences for it, basically. It's the same in the army. And the Russian army has been behaving in a very unlovely way, at least episodically in previous conflicts, for instance, in Chechnya and in Syria. So this isn't a surprise. There are very, very high levels of alcoholism, drunkenness at least. So these boys are pissed much of the time. We don't know how far the more senior military folks, if you can still hear me, we're going to take a break. So we don't know how far the more senior folks on the ground are participating in this, or how far they are, as it were, just helpless to do anything about it. I guess it's 50-50. I guess that half of them would feel they just get lynched if they try to stop their soldiers. The other half are participating in it and participating in the looting too. That's clearly because they know that there will be no consequences for them. Now, does this mean that this was directly ordered from the very top? No, it doesn't. What was ordered from the top? Well, I think that there would have been a hostage taking and a kill list for key political figures in Ukraine, and Zelensky would have obviously been the number one name on that. One of the central goals of this operation in the first 24, 48, 72 hours was to capture Zelensky. But that wasn't tied to even bombing civilian areas. That only kicked in a couple of days into the war. So there wouldn't have been any plan to do any kind of mass killing of civilians. That's happened because of basically everything we've described. So the correct thing to say is that this is not ordered from the top, but it is institutionalized. It's not just pissed soldiers, going off and doing things for which they'll be held accountable. They will not be held accountable for this. There's no doubt about that. Now, quickly, your second question, which is just a comment and not a question, about the awful plight of migrants in our world and how to think about it. And we're going to have a separate conversation about this on the main channel in a couple of months, I think. I do think the Ukrainians are lucky to be white, particularly if we look at these East European countries in the European Union. They're countries that have really struggled to understand this deal that they were offered, which is you join this European community, but in exchange you give up your aspiration to be a mono-ethnic country. And they've really struggled to give that aspiration up. There's no doubt about that. And we're really in a world where, for the reasons of the climate crisis, we're about to see extraordinary flows of refugees over the decades ahead. And we're also going to see the political systems of countries destabilized by the reception of refugees. And one of the problems we've got with our Western democracies at the moment is that there's a conflict between a generous policy that takes folks in, a policy that is admirable from a human rights point of view, and a policy that secures democratic stability. And in the 1990s, we have tended to think that, okay, we're going to advocate for a generous policy, and then secondly, we're going to try to persuade the population. And that's really impossible now. In other words, you've got to check what the level of civic consent is, and then tailor a policy to that. And if you want more, we've got to go out there and try to stretch the level of civic consent. What is very destructive for Western democracies is to jump the gun and do something that their population isn't happy with, because that's a recipe for essentially undermining and diluting trust in institutions to a point that existentially puts these democracies at risk. So there is a conflict between democratic sustenance and human rights when it comes to the issue of migration in the West. And the fact that I'm sitting in this building in East London, and I wouldn't mind if it were filled with Syrians and Ukrainians. Well, I get to share a society with other citizens, and my view is just the preference of one individual at this point. So that's a little bit of an answer for you, Annie. I hope it works. Our second question comes from Rupert Read. Rupert's a philosopher, professor of philosophy at UEA, and a climate advocate. And Rupert says, can you confirm that you agree with the arguments recently made in an interview by Grigory Yudin, who is a sociologist of the younger generation from Russia? And I think Yudin is doing fine now. He was beaten up by the National Guard during an anti-war protest a few weeks ago. I probably only agree with 80% of what Yudin says, but I'm going to take that 20% off the table and pick out the main points briefly, which I do think are very similar to the points we've been making on the channel. So thank you, Rupert, for sending me this interview. I'm very sympathetic with what Yudin says. Yudin says that escalation, that's my word, not his, but it means the same thing, that the escalation of the Kremlin is independent of any particular country or any particular issue. So it's not about Ukraine, it's not about Poland. It's not about any particular country. It's a pattern, and there are different frontiers on this pattern. And that's it. I agree with that. Now, Yudin says that a regime like this Russian regime has suicidal tendencies. In other words, it can easily take steps that flatten it economically, and it can also easily take steps that destabilize it. This regime can take steps that, from any logical point of view, make Putin's stay in power less likely. I agree with that. And Yudin says that the idea that the use of tactical nuclear weapons or just nuclear weapons is impossible, that idea doesn't make sense. There is no sort of red line of rationality we can draw there that will tell us Putin will never do this. It's a practical question for Putin. There are reasons against doing it that are pretty strong, but it's simply going to be a pragmatic calculation of the moment that Putin simply makes or doesn't make. So here is what I would say, independently from Yudin, but there might be quite a bit of overlap between his view and mine here. And that's that if I had to say what the telos of this Russian regime is in its current incarnation, it's war. The whole damn thing is set up to start wars. Now, that's even more simplified than the simplified stuff we've already said on the main channel, but that's what we should do now, answering questions briefly. That's where we are. And therefore, it's not crazy to imagine a second Ukrainian war in 2025 when Putin tries to do things he didn't succeed doing this time. This is completely plausible. So there is the pattern of escalation there. It could encompass at least a consideration of tactical nuclear weapons. It's not tied to any particular country. And this pattern of escalation is largely about Putin, but it's not just about Putin. It's structured into the very essence of the regime. And one day we'll talk about what kind of a political restructuring in Russia would be necessary to take Russia off this militarist and imperialist path that it would be on, whoever was the person replacing Putin, as long as the general structure remained the same. And I'm just going to throw into Rupert's question a few other questions that are specifically about nuclear risk and nuclear launch. And this is all I'll say, because I'm not a military expert and we don't do military commentary on this or the other channel. But the questions, and these questions have been sent in their dozens, so people want to know, do you think that those around Putin would allow him to not launch a nuclear weapon, and would they allow him to annihilate half of the world? And second question here, I want to know if Putin goes for a total nuclear strike, how is that executed? What's the high-ranking officers that are going to be involved in this? There's going to be a chain of 5 to 7 parties that this is going to go through. And I think that there is some dispute, and this is why it's not my job to go into this, some dispute among military experts exactly how stable that chain is. In other words, it's more predictable what that chain will look like if we assess what's going on with Western countries and their nuclear protocols. In Russia, it's a little bit obscure, so it's not clear exactly how that chain will be framed, but it's several links, 5 links, could be 7 links, and the non-military considerations we should bring to the table is that obviously it matters that Putin thinks that his command will be executed. And if Putin thinks his command stands a chance of not being executed, he will not be likely to give it. And it also means that the folks executing the command have got to feel that Putin's political capital is strong enough. They don't want to do this and then end up in really, really serious trouble. 2 years later when the Putin regime collapses. And I do think that it matters very much what kind of nuclear use we're talking about. And Putin is more likely to get away with a very delimited tactical strike on a NATO installation that is guaranteed to kill 0 civilians, for example. He's more likely to get away with that. Doesn't mean this is likely, but it certainly means it's not off the table of options. It's part of a toolbox, but that's not to say it's a tool that's going to be used. Our next question comes from Steve Balkin. Steve is, I think, emeritus professor at Roosevelt University. And Steve says, Vlad, you've said that Russians hate Westerners now. It's sort of citizen-to-citizen hatred. Is this true? How does it work? So, Vlad, please explain the anti-USA animosity by ordinary Russians. If I think of something that's a good publication on this, I'll send it your way, Steve. But just conversationally, if we look at Soviet propaganda, it was ugly in all kinds of ways, and it was anti-Semitic. But it wasn't really made up of sort of hatred of ordinary Americans. If anything, the thought was, well, we're doing this communist experiment. If this experiment goes well, it's not going well at the moment, but if it goes well, then everybody would be happy under this sort of social formation, and indeed Americans would flourish under it too, and there's nothing wrong with Americans inherently. That reached a kind of dreamy idealization of the West at the very tail point of the Soviet regime, when people thought that the West was almost a kind of utopia. And then this began to fragment. It fragmented in the 1990s when the economic policies implemented in Russia were blamed on the West. And there was the perception that this was, if not imposed by the West, then at least proposed by the West, and that it's caused harm to Russia. And there was this sort of feeling that, well, look, Russia was already the site of a kind of Western experiment in 1917. I mean, no ideology is more Western than Marxism. But there was also the feeling that there was this other experiment in the early 90s, and again, we left it up to the West to tell us what should happen in our country, and it didn't work, so screw them. But at this point, there still was no hatred of ordinary folks and in the ordinary citizens in the West. And even in the early Putin years, that remained true. And Putin was very exercised about Russia being disrespected on the world stage. He was very exercised about NATO expansion. He got a lot of Russians to be exercised about this too. But this was, again, against NATO. It wasn't against ordinary Americans. But then things began to change. So one change is that from 2012 onward, Putin, and with Putin, the Russian propaganda machinery, took a kind of civilizational turn. And we talked about this on the main channel. And they began to talk about Western civilization being a civilization in decay. They began to talk about Western values as being corrupt, as being an expression of alienation, an expression of some kind of spiritual poverty. Basically, the West was in a kind of historical and spiritual cul-de-sac that Russia needed to avoid. So that began. What happened then, more recently, particularly from the time of the Trump presidency, is that Western culture wars have been mobilized in Russia and mobilized by Russian propaganda. And what we sometimes refer to as political correctness or cancel culture was very much manipulated by the Russian propaganda machinery to, again, make a kind of cultural criticism of the West. There was something really wrong with these people. They couldn't focus on the right things. They kept arguing about their little identities. They kept talking about sexual identities, gender identities. They were basically sinking in all kinds of nonsense. And this was really, 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 again, a civilization in decline. But now there was this sort of anti-Western identity politics move. So these two shifts, I think, are very, very important. And there is a guy in Russia called Vladimir Posner who spent a bit of time on US television as well. He used to be a Soviet propagandist, and then he was a journalist who was unobjectively apologetic for the Putin regime, to some degree, at least in my view. But he speaks perfect English. He is a French and American citizen as well as a Russian citizen. In fact, his family moved him as a kid as a young man to Russia in the Stalin period. And here was this French man, grew up in New York, and he was moved to Stalinist Russia. So his really solid experience of the Soviet Union and of Russia today is in his late 80s now. His show was recently taken off from Channel 1 in Russia. It wasn't owned by Channel 1, it was bought by Channel 1, but there we go, he was still on that propaganda channel. But he speaks, when he speaks in English, if you Google him up and look him up on YouTube very often, about how this sort of hatred of Western citizens developed in Russia, that now Russians hate Americans, not just the American government. That's a little bit, basically, of an answer, Steve. I'm not sure how satisfactory it is, but I'm basically saying we're dating this to about 10 years ago, and we're putting this down to changes in Putin and changes in the Russian propaganda machinery. Next question is scary. It comes from Mihkel Kodak, who is in Estonia, and he says, Vlad, please discuss the risk of Russian military actions in the Baltic countries and the objectives that the Russian government may have regarding the Baltics. I often say that if I owned an apartment in Tbilisi, I would calculate in a 10% risk that it would come to be in Russian territory within the next few years. I think that risk might be lower in the Baltics. But I do think that while, if I lived in really anywhere in the Baltics, I would be comfortable enough to just carry on living there, and I wouldn't plan to leave at this point. But would I raise the question once a year? Okay, how we're looking for the next year? Should I think about leaving? Should I not? I think I would. It doesn't mean I would leave, but it's something I'd keep reassessing. So what do you look out for? Well, I think that the key thing you look out for is Putin's strategy of concocting that there is some Russian population there somewhere, and that it's being maltreated, and that it's supposedly asking for help, and then Putin can go in and send help. Is Putin in principle open to engaging in military action against a NATO country? In principle, yes. Again, there isn't some kind of red line we can draw there in virtue of, rational choice considerations. No, he's in principle open, doesn't mean he's going to do it. So what I would look for is basically any kind of gambit that's available to Putin, whereby there is the possibility to concoct a Russian population that's being maltreated by the local culture or the local government. So of course, we'd measure to some degree the Baltic states in terms of where there is the biggest Russian population. There is the biggest Russian population in Estonia, and that's going to have to be a consideration. But at the moment, I would say no. I'd be happy to keep on saying this is my home. I ain't going anywhere, and at the moment it's okay. But it needs to be reassessed. Next question is from Steve Sheldon, and he asks, what's Putin's plan for succession? This is going to be a quick answer. There is no plan for succession. There is absolutely no procedure for this eventuality. And that is why before this war, people were beginning to shift around a little bit and wonder, well, how do we think about the future? This guy is 70. We're going to be here when he isn't. So what are we going to do? Now, admittedly, a lot of the people around Putin are similar age to him, but nevertheless, this thought was not just available to people, it was already part of tactical and strategic calculations. But that's not to say there were any plans implemented. There is no structure for succession, basically. There just isn't any. And Putin feels that he cannot today leave office safely if he wanted to. There's a big part of him that wants to. In fact, he has this sense of mission. He feels that he can't let it go. He's sort of absorbed in historical delusory phantasmagoria. But at the same time, he's also tired and he wants to go. But he knows he can't. He can't safely leave. He has built no procedures to ensure that he could be taken care of. So he is as a hostage to his post, and there is absolutely zero structure So the idea of a successor being groomed is just completely impossible. It's totally unavailable. If anything, this is something that Putin is going to try to keep as uncertain as possible to make sure that the strategies for succession that might be discussed behind his back are not implemented. Andrew Simon Green asks, what's Putin talking about when he's saying that it's a geopolitical catastrophe that the Soviet Union collapsed? Is Putin talking about a return to communism? No, he is not talking about the return to communism. There is no ideological consequence to his remark. You should really see this remark as being continuous with the worst traditions of the Russian Empire. So this is not an ideological point, and Putin did not want the Soviet Union, the Marxist-Leninist formation or deformation, to carry on. That's not what that comment is. Miss S from Poland asks, what's going to happen in Russia over the next couple of months? Will domestic propaganda be changed, and will the Russians still believe it? Well, greetings back to Poland from East London. I think that the thing that we got to watch out for is the period when the Russians realize that things have very seriously changed. They haven't realized that yet as a collective. Only about 15% of the population are aware of this, properly aware of this. The rest are still in dreamland. So it's by summertime that they're going to realize many of the effects of the sanctions. And it's by, I think, early summertime that they're going to begin to at least have access to the thought that the war has indeed gone badly. So we're going to have to see what happens with these two realizations. What the domestic propaganda will try to do is sever, and we said this in the last video, in the minds of Russians, the consequences of the sanctions from the pursuit of the war. They'll try to say that Ukraine was about to attack us first. We did this military operation to prevent a war. And if we didn't do it, there would have been an even worse war. And basically, we are having a conflict with NATO, and Ukraine is just one minor front of that conflict. And so don't think of these sanctions as being anything really to do with Ukraine. It's rather that Ukraine is a small part of our confrontation with NATO, and the sanctions are a much bigger gambit in this war against the West, against NATO, than the Ukraine itself is. Are Russians going to believe this? I think most of them will believe it, yes. They will see the sanctions as an act of war against Russia. That's a more significant act of war than Russia's involvement in Ukraine is an act of war against NATO. So that's how this is going to be sold to them. This is how they're going to think. At the moment, fewer people actively support this war than it looks, according to the polls, because the rejection rates are so extreme when people are offered to participate in the poll. Also because so many people work for the state in public services, and at work they are told, come on, you got to support this thing, you got to support this thing. In the evening they get a call saying, do you support the military operation? They're more likely to say yes. They're afraid as well. So I actually think probably only half of Russians genuinely support this military operation. But we're going to have to see how the different demographics evolve. Interestingly, the poorest Russians are less supportive of the war than the wealthier Russians. So we're going to have to track all of these demographic nuances. But the key message is that the Russians are going to get is this is a conflict, a major conflict. That's a civilizational conflict. It's a geopolitical conflict. And that conflict isn't really triggered by what we've done in Ukraine. Vallee Louise asks, can you explain what the role of the FSB is inside the country and how many people work as FSB agents? No, I can't, because I'm not a military channel and I can't offer the Wikipedia sort of answers. My expertise is in how democracies survive and flourish, in how authoritarian regimes form, how people engage in politics in the modern world. I mean, briefly, from that sort of point of view, there's a couple of things we can say about the FSB. It's one of the agencies that the Russians have. Another agency is the GIU, which is the military intelligence. And another agency is the SVR, which is the foreign intelligence. And so the SVR do the foreign intelligence, not the FSB. The FSB is the most direct descendant of the Cheka, which was then the NKVD, which was then the KGB. One big difference between the FSB and the KGB is that the FSB owns property and it's very, very corrupt. So it's not just a tool of the state, it's a kind of a weird sort of organization that has a lot of resources to it. The number of people, if you exclude the border guard that I think the FSB has control over, the number of folks who are employed by the FSB would be in the many, many tens of thousands. It wouldn't be true to say that Russia is run by the FSB. I mean, there are different agencies, there are different clans, there are different individuals who have influence. And so the FSB is sort of one player among several others, let's say among, 7, 8, who is very, very close to the center of power. But you can't say the FSB is running the country. And the FSB is indeed in trouble now, with a lot of high-ranking folks being put under arrest or removed because the preparation for the Ukraine war is now, as Putin recognizes, gone so badly, and that the work on the ground was either a complete flop or, worse and more likely, a terribly corrupt and complete flop, with lots of money being siphoned off that really was meant to be used to foment a welcome for the Russians when they came in. So that's a bit where we are with the FSB. The other thing to say is that the FSB is refusing to acknowledge the scale of the crimes of the Soviet system. So Bortnikov claims that Stalin killed about 700,000 people. So there is a recognition of the crimes. But I think historians would put that figure closer to maybe 15 million, because what's missing are the people who weren't simply taken and directly executed. There were people killed via the enforced famine in Ukraine. There were people killed via the ethnic deportations. There were people killed via the camps. The camps weren't killing camps like the Nazi concentration camps, but they were camps with such a high death rate that they were to some degree killing camps too. And so there is a kind of at least a 20-fold underestimation of the crimes of the Soviet period. So the FSB is implicated in Russia's failure to come to terms with its own past. The next question comes from Karen, and Karen is saying, is it right to think of the Russian population as being sort of depoliticized to the point that even if they don't think of the government as doing the right thing, they still are inclined to say, well, the government are doing whatever they're doing, they're going to take care of these decisions that need to be made, and these decisions are really not our business, and we're going to try to stay in our lane here. Is that true? And also, what are the Russians going to think about the sanctions? Are they going to think that it's a punishment they're receiving from the West for no good reason? I do think that you're right, Karen. I think that the depoliticization of ordinary Russians leaves them in this predicament of feeling that they are a population living on a territory, they're not citizens, and they're kind of meant to sometimes play the role of citizens, but they don't feel comfortable in it. They don't feel that comfortable to even support Putin openly. They certainly don't feel comfortable to oppose Putin. They just would prefer to not go with it. And if they have to, they will say, okay, Putin, great, whatever, okay, bye-bye now, I'm done with this politics business. That's very common. Now, how are they going to think about the sanctions? Yeah, they're going to be sold a lot of propaganda, as we've just said in answer to a previous question. And the propaganda is going to say, don't connect the sanctions with the Ukraine war. And I think the Russians will, in sufficient numbers, probably buy that. They're going to think that there is a big conflict with the West. The sanctions are a non-military act of war against the Russian population, and they just prove that there is so much animosity against Russia in the world, and Russia has to sort of hunker down and endure and survive and to some extent rally around its leader. Not pretty, but mostly true. Marcus asks to comment on Alexander Dugin and the neo-Eurasianist identity that Dugin is elaborating and the possible influences on the Kremlin of Dugin's thought. This would appear to be a coherent anti-liberal ideology and a blind spot for Western commentators. I think that Dugin needs a deeper dive to be properly assessed. Do I think that he is a serious philosopher? No, I don't. Do his ideas matter? Yes. Are his ideas taken as seriously by Russians who are trying to explain the Putin regime as they are by Westerners who are trying to take the explain the Putin regime? No, they're not. So if I were to name you the 5 or the 7 best experts on the Putin regime, virtually none of them would ever use Dugin to explain anything. That doesn't mean using Dugin is useless, because I think that there are some things that Dugin explains, concentrates, systematizes, elaborates, that are potentially worth attending to as a psychological clue, at least, to what's going on in Putin's head. But that's a different thing to saying that Putin would look at Dugin's writings and take ideas from them and systematically implement them. No, that's not really how it works. So that's, I think, the beginning of an answer. Do I really think that this is a coherent and serious set of ideas that Dugin is presenting? Well, no, I don't. But I do think that they need assessment. And I do think that they have some interest to them because they are part of a certain current of Slavophilic thought that I think has place in the way many Russians think and in the way Putin thinks. David Peterson asks many questions. I'm going to take a couple of them. And the questions are, what's Ukraine going to have to sacrifice to get peace? What should it sacrifice to get peace? What's the future of Ukraine vis-a-vis EU and NATO? Will there be a return for millions of Ukrainian refugees? And does Putin count whatever he gets as enough of a victory to save face and keep power? It's close for Putin, but Putin's clearly going to try to sell something, particularly on the 9th of May celebrations, and say that that's a victory. There is always the possibility of a second Ukrainian war that you can't rule out in 2026, let's say, when Putin goes at it again. If that doesn't happen, and if Russia now chops off a good bit of Ukraine and just goes away, territorially chops off and goes away, Ukraine has the ingredients to flourish, because Ukraine now has a very well-formed sense of civic identity. That's a pluralistic identity, that's a democratic identity, it's a Western-looking identity, and you can build a very successful state off the back of that. Moreover, Ukraine can become a hub for Russian culture at its best, not the Putinist, imperialist Russian culture, but the Russian culture that's continuous with the best things we all love about Russia, including Russia's extraordinary cultural contributions. On NATO, I would say that as long as Russia is not a collapsed state, it will not let Ukraine join NATO. I mean, Putin would rather nuke Ukraine than allow it to be inside NATO. So as long as anything like this regime sustains itself in Moscow, Ukraine cannot join NATO, but the European Union is more negotiable. Cosmic Foxglove asks 2 questions. We're going to answer both of them. The first is, how true do you think the quote is, every nation gets the government it deserves? This needs an episode of its own on the main channel, but basically what you've got to always do is give the most faithful bottom-up and the most faithful top-down explanation of what's going on. And there are some Western journalists with a focus on Russia who over the years have failed to do that. And I'm absolutely not going to name any names, Luke Harding. And the thing about these kind of journalists is that they can give you the impression that Putin has simply hijacked the country, and that we don't need to analyze much as long as we simply get rid of him. And that's a risk that you run if you just continually demonize Putin, which is not a problematic thing to do. I demonize him too. But you also want explanation, you want social explanation, and you want explanation of problems that Russia faces, of the processes of political restructuring that it's going to need to go through. And to simply say that there is no bottom-up explanation for why Russia has failed so deeply politically and why it's got this government is absurd. It's completely absurd. And that is the implication of a lot of Western Russian experts and their discourse on the country. So you've always got to say that it's going to have to be a top-down and a bottom-up explanatory balance. And it's going to be different. God damn it, it's going to be different in each country. You can't just go around and saying, well, if this is an authoritarian regime, it looks like a dictatorship. We're just going to speak about it in this sort of hijacked terms. No, you can't do that. You always have to have a very complex, very sensitive top-down and bottom-up conversation simultaneously. That's the 2 cents on it. Obviously, this needs a longer conversation. The other question you ask is, why is Putin so badly informed? Well, these regimes, particularly the hybrid authoritarian regimes that are so sort of fluid and ill-defined, with slightly poorly defined information patterns, these regimes inherently fall out of touch. I mean, the Russian regime is inherently out of touch with what's going on within its borders. And then over and above that, stay at the top of that regime, that as long as Putin stays, always going to land you in trouble. A good, I think, a target is 15 years. I think if anybody stays in that kind of position more than 15 years, they really begin to lose contact with reality. And you're seeing that palpably with Putin. Also, Putin is inherently suspicious of the internet. He's got a kind of almost neurotic suspiciousness about it, where you can say, Putin, what's wrong with the internet? Well, none of it is trustworthy, none of it can be verified. I want folders with information that's signed by particular individuals. I know who these individuals are. I know who to hold accountable if stuff in my folders is false. Also, of course, Putin is being fed information that is set up to meet his expectations around what he wants to hear. So these are many of the typical and predictable problems that you have when you've got a regime like that, it falls out of touch, and you've got a person at the top of a regime like that, they also fall out of touch, and they also become deformed psychologically and become less healthy and become less able to process information. So all of that. Next question is from LanaDragon, and what we're looking at here is what is going to happen next in terms of the future of the world and Europe as this war unfolds. What are the most possible outcomes and timelines? Do you see this war dragging on for a long time? What's going to happen with the nuclear threat? And is this something that the EU will have to live with until Putin dies? How will this impact people and the economy around the globe? Obviously, these are not questions that you can answer briefly. It's going to be an economic hit to the countries that have had to make sacrifices to impose these sanctions on Russia. There is no doubt about that. We can still go further with these sanctions. The threat of nuclear escalation will continue as long as Putin is in power, and if Putin's successor is a successor who essentially succeeds within the similar structure as the structure we've got now in the Kremlin, then these threats will indeed continue too. Russia will become increasingly isolated, but it's not set up to be an autarkic state. So it's going to try to relock itself into threads of globalization by some kind of means. It's going to try to twist and turn and get there. We don't know how long this war will drag on and in what form, but as we've already said, it's possible there will be other frontiers on this wave of escalation that the Kremlin is engaging in. And in terms of nuclear risk, again, we've basically got to reformat the way we think. It's not about panicking and saying, well, there's going to be a nuclear war next week. What are we going to do? It's rather saying, well, look, we're going to be now in a period of years and years where the nuclear risk will just be higher, and we're going to have to live with that discomfort without panicking about it. That's as much as I can do for now, but of course all of these questions deserve bigger answers. Next question comes from Liam Richardson, who asks, could there be mutinies in the military that are significant, and could they lead to other mutinies and perhaps larger protests from the population? No, I mean, that's not on the cards in the near future. The military itself is not strong enough to constitute a threat, so it's not plausible in the near future to imagine any kind of military attempt to take power. And the incompetence of the Russian military is to that degree not accidental. Regimes like this regime cannot have the GIU or the FSB or the military get too powerful because they'll constitute a risk to Putin's throne. But basically what we're waiting for is some kind of series of tectonic shifts underneath that give enough people in Russia an indication that going out and protesting is going to achieve something more than just losing their job and getting beaten up and arrested. At the moment, that's basically where we're at. So even the recommendation that's often given from outside to Russians to go out and protest is questionable, because at this moment, that's simply not going to do anything. Could this change a year from now? Yeah, events are very, very remarkable things. But at the moment, there's very little ground for protest to prove efficacious. Our last question is really important, actually. It comes from Jorn Zander. And Jorn asks, isn't Russia just too Western in its lifestyle now to make its people happy to go the North Korean way? I think this is a very powerful factor, but it's a powerful factor for a small demographic, about 15% of the population, let's say. And there are a lot of people in Moscow and Petersburg, many of them are leaving, and they're going to be leaving in the hundreds of thousands, who are thinking, what the hell have you done with our free media, with our McDonald's, and with our iPhones? Where is all of this stuff? And that's important, but that's not the demographic that's going to be key. That's largely the demographic that already either didn't love Putin or was sort of semi-reluctant about him, was perhaps working for public services, and so was not keen to go out and criticize Putin too directly. But nevertheless, this is a population that's roughly aware that Russia is a bit in the shit and that Putin is not good for the country. The effect of the sanctions is going to be most likely so significant that it's not going to be about McDonald's. It's going to be about, why is our elevator not working in our building? Why has the water stopped? Why is the heating not working? Why is our infrastructure screwed and the transport is not working properly? Why can't I afford food? So we're going to have many, many Russians, particularly the poorest Russians, really struggle with sustenance. And I do think that that's going to be far more important of an impact than loss of Western gadgets or Western cultural items or Western conveniences or Western brands or Western sort of pop culture. I think that this is going to be the essence of the hit of the sanctions, and the regime is going to try to persuade people that that's all the more reason to rally around Putin. And so if Putin fails with this, then it's these people, the people whose elevators don't work and who can't afford to eat. These are the people who are going to be pissed. Whatever happens, my iPhone doesn't work and I can't buy a new one, that demographic is going to be important, significant. It's the demographic that all of us who are having these conversations are probably going to be most at home with at the level of sharing a dinner party, but it's not going to be the demographic that decides Russia's future. It should decide Russia's future. It is an elite. These are the thinking Russians. These are the Russians who are reflective and lucid about Russia's cultural status, Russia's identity. But at the moment, there's this kind of a civil war in Russia, and the thinking party is the losing party, and it's not likely to be decisive in the events that happen in the near future, in my view.